All right, let's go on. Now, so the Christian, as I'm saying here, lives in both. Now for some new stuff. As an individual who lives in both realms, the left and the right, he claims no rights. He claims no rights. Okay? Where am I? Oh, I'm okay. Okay. Christian lives in both realms. He claims no rights. Because he knows that by living in the gospel, he lives always at the hand of God's mercy and at the bottom of God's delivery of grace. He lives always in a dependent, passive sense, and he claims no rights. I believe this is critical to our Christian understanding. And I have become quite adamant about this. Does a Christian have rights? No. You have no rights. Let me finish, and I'll deal with this. As a Christian, you have no rights. You have gifts delivered. And there's a big difference between gift and right. Right implies somehow inherently mine. And gift means something delivered by mercy and grace. Now, as Christians, we have many gifts delivered to us. And we have many things that have been extended to us. But to say that we have somehow inherent rights is not a Christian idea. Because inherent rights mean that somehow, just by virtue of the fact that I was born, or by virtue of the fact that I was conceived, I have certain rights. Now, in America, we have rights given to us by our Constitution. Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments. And we tend to think that, oh yeah, those rights are somehow built in. And they're not. They're given to us because the Constitution decided these are things, it's going to work this way in this country, and we'll have these rights, and we're going to extend these rights, which is nice. But these are gifts as well. Gifts given to us by the country. God is working through that left hand, and this country has decided we're going to extend these rights to our citizens. That's nice. I'm grateful for that. And I am pleased to have those rights. But to say that they are somehow inherently mine because I'm a creature, no. Creatures don't have rights. Creatures are dependent on their Creator for everything. They live not with a sense of entitlement, but with a sense of gratitude. And there's a big difference here. So Christians, and this is where I'm getting at, and I was already hinting, and I'll talk more about this as we go along here. Christians have a fundamentally different worldview than anyone else in the culture. Because a Christian does not function out of individual inherent rights. Rather, the Christian functions in the attitude of, I am a creature dependent on my Creator for everything, and anything I have is purely a gift of His mercy, something I cannot expect, I cannot demand, I simply receive with awestruck gratitude. You gave me life. You put me in a home that cares for me. Wow. You've given me a country that, is functioning, that gives me many benefits. Wow. And the list goes on. Every single thing is simply gift. Everything. Your big, hard-earned nest egg, is that yours? I earned it. No, you didn't. You earned it with labor that God allowed you to do. You earned it with skills given to you by God because He allowed you to be trained in those skills. You achieved nothing. Everything you have is derived. Everything you have is dependent. We are dependent creatures. That's what it means to be creature. And you don't like this very much because it goes against every bone in your body. Because we want to be autonomous. We want to matter. We want to count. And what Christianity is all about is you don't. You are dependent upon God. When you go waltzing into God's presence, what do you go carrying? Nothing. Look what I've accomplished, God. Aren't you impressed? No, He's not. We have nothing to offer. We simply plead for His forgiveness, and He gives it. And so, this is the basic premise. Christianity is premised not on rights. Christianity is premised on gospel. Gospel is not a right. It's gift. You do not have a right to the gospel, my friend. You have a right to hell, if you want to talk about rights. Okay? So you don't have a right to the gospel. You don't have a right to forgiveness. This is gift. The world in which we live doesn't get this. In fact, the world in which we live, our American Western culture, that's the world we're living in, is diametrically opposed to this. Okay? Consider this. Let's take a look at something together. You guys recognize that? Declaration of Independence, okay? And here we have it in actually legible print. Oh, you can read it. Great. Here we go. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, in other words, England, and to assume among the powers of the earth this separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, that sounds so Christian. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Bottom line, here's why we're leaving England. Okay, next paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, what's Christian about any of that? Nothing. And this is not a happy moment for a lot of you. All right? Founding document, Declaration of Independence. Hey, it talks about God. Oh, it's a little crooked. I'll try to get it straighter for you. It talks about God. It sounds good. Laws of nature and of nature's God. Certain unalienable rights. The key phrase here, guys, is where it says that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. All right? And then here's the key line. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's everything, right there. What's the source of a government's power? According to the Declaration of Independence, what's the source of the government's power? The people. The people. The consent of the governed. In other words, if you consent to the government, then the government's legitimate. And if you, the people, don't consent to it, then it's illegitimate. That's the premise of the Declaration of Independence. That's the premise of our country. It is the basic operating principle, the consent of the governed. So, according to the Declaration of Independence, authority derives from the people who have these inalienable rights. Jefferson said inalienable rights, given to them by the Creator. So there's this Creator. And remember I talked about this week 1. Were the Founding Fathers believers in God? For the most part, yes. They acknowledged God because the Enlightenment hadn't gotten far enough to get rid of God yet. And I'm quite serious. It's not because they were such pious men. It's just because the Enlightenment hadn't moved that far yet. And that's how we have to remember. The Enlightenment is a history that moves from the time of Descartes way back in the 16th century, early 17th. We've got Descartes all the way back, a couple generations after Luther, who makes the first move of saying, what do I know for sure? I know I exist. And when Descartes makes this conclusion, remember the Latin, cogito ergo sum, remember that? I think, therefore I am. What Descartes does with that famous statement is he moves the beginning point from God to man. And then he proceeds to say, and I believe in God because I think that's reasonable. And for generations, everybody who followed Descartes said, yep, God's important. He's got work to do. We still need him. We still need him. Because God takes care of things like where we came from. God takes care of justice. And it makes sense we need a God. And everything was cool. And 1776, do the enlightened, rational thinkers of the world still believe in God? Yes, for the most part. Because it seems to make sense. But within a couple generations, that was all starting to crumble. And by the time you get 100 years later, it's falling apart. Because the push, starting with Descartes, has gotten to the point with the Enlightenment thinking that I don't know if we really need God anymore. God's nothing more, Feuerbach said, than the projection of man's highest aspirations. Man has made him up. And man likes God because he feels good, but they don't need him. And then Nietzsche took him one step further and said, no more God. We're done with him. Forget it. And off we go. Then the 20th century is the fruit of the Enlightenment. Beautiful century where mankind learns to love one another and wars taken care of and no more wars and everybody just gets along, right? And the 20th century goes down in history as the bloodiest, nastiest century in the history of the world. That's the fruit of the Enlightenment. That's what you get. And the point I'm trying to make tonight is the Declaration of Independence is an Enlightenment document. It is not a Christian document. Were Christian men involved? Yes. Are there Christian principles? Well, that depends on how you define Christian principle. I'll talk about that just in a minute, a little more. But the point is, what's really driving this is not God as the center, but God as the creator, God who kicked the thing and got it started, and then stepped back and let it roll, which is what deism believes. And there were deists all over the place involved in this. But deists are kind of a slice too. They weren't all deists. They were Christians and deists, and they were all kind of working together. But what happened was you had this Enlightenment idea that man is the source of authority. And that's where all the mischief begins. That's where all the mischief begins. Because a Christian would say, wrong. God is the source of authority. God is where it starts. So what would we say? What does Romans 13 say? All authority comes from God. What did Jesus say to Pontius Pilate? You would not have any authority except that we're given to you from above. Not just Caesar from above. So it's all derived. So authority does not come from the consent of the governed. Authority comes from God. This is a huge difference. And so that's why I have contended that this country is not founded on Christian principles. Because if it were founded on Christian principles, we would say mankind has no rights. Mankind is living as a creature before God, grateful for what is given in grace, and it is given grace in Jesus Christ. Thank God for that. Now, as derived people, dependent upon God's truth, what are we going to do to live as God's people? How are we going to do this? It'd be a completely different document. It might come to the same conclusions. It might even function with a kind of a federalist system. I have no quarrel with that. Federalism is pretty brilliant because it takes into account fallen nature, and that's pretty smart. But the idea that somehow this is a Christian document is far-fetched at best. It's not a Christian document because it starts with man, and it doesn't start with God. And you guys, when we look around the world in America today, and we say, oh, we've come so far from our godly beginnings. Well, yeah, we have, because what's happened is man, 200 years later, has decided, hey, our governed consent here is changing our mind. We don't want to be moral anymore. And we want to do things our way. And who's going to decide what's right? We do. That's how it works. How is right and wrong decided in our country? Majority vote. And if 51% say that's right, guess what? It's right. It's how we do abortion. Is abortion on demand a right? Well, we've decided it is. And if 51% think it's okay, it's okay. It's not wrong. Because, you see, there's nothing bigger than the consent of the governed. There's nothing more fundamental than the consent of the governed. All there is the consent of the governed. And if the majority think that way, that's what's right. That's what we've got. And that's where we're going. And that's why when people say things like, we need to get back to our foundation, I think, no, that's not going to help it one little bit because we never left it. We're still solidly on the foundation because the foundation is centered on man, not God. All right? So, like I said, this might be a little disturbing to you. And I'll pause here to allow you to ask a few questions because you might have a couple. Yes? I don't know. I'm not saying you have to. Okay. What you need to do is this. Now, Okay, now what I've done is just, I've done a very nice work of deconstruction. At least I think it has been. That's what my intention was. Now, what I want you to realize is this. When we're living in the left hand, as citizens of this country, the Constitution is normative. And we can talk about rights, and we can talk about how things work, and we can talk about responsibilities that go with those rights, and we do all that kind of thing. And you can teach a great deal of civil righteousness and inject these kinds of things. But what I think you can get away with in public school, even there, is to say, you know, I wonder if it's really true that the people are the final authority. Isn't there something more foundational? You can ask questions. And I'm not saying, and in the public school, I know you're bound with all kinds of things you can't say or can't do. But you can open the door to maybe questions. And you can maybe help even the Christian kids who are sitting there realize, yeah, I know what he's talking about. There is a greater authority. And in other words, you don't have to be doing the party line, hook, line, and sinker. You can teach what needs to be taught. This is what it means to be a citizen. This is how the Constitution is set up. This is how it works. And you can point out it's founded on the consent of the governed. But you can ask the open-ended question. Or you might even say, you know, there are some people who might disagree with that a little bit. And who might suggest that perhaps there's a greater authority than the people. And I don't think you'll get in trouble for that, necessarily. You know how the rules work better than I do. You live them. But I hear what you're saying. I don't think you have to worry about, oh my goodness, I'm going to be betraying myself. You know, if you get to that point, that's an issue of conscience. And you have to decide where you need to be and what you're doing. But can you serve God in a vocation, in a public school? I think you can. It's just that you have to be more careful, a little more shrewd about how you go about it. But I think you can ask questions and make statements that make people think, which is always a good thing in school. Okay? Now, I appreciate your dilemma. And you're living, I think, which is where I'm going to go here. You know, I've talked a lot about how left hand and right hand is both God's. But the fact of the matter is, when the left hand is living at odds with God's purposes, it becomes increasingly difficult to live in a comfortable way in that left hand. It's not easy. And one of the things I am hoping to do before I finish here this week and next is I want you to begin to realize that if we take seriously the call to live a Christian life, we're going to find ourselves seriously out of step with the culture around us and increasingly at odds with it. And it's not such an easy mix. And again, no one wants to hear this. People who come to church don't want to be told, guess what? You have to go out and be a pain in the neck of your neighbor. They don't want to be told that. But that's kind of what it comes down to. And so that's part of that kind of that agitation that we bring as we start to challenge some of the assumptions. Now, so that's a fair question. Any other questions? I got another point I want to make. I'll make a note so I don't forget. But any other questions you have here? Because I gave you the chance, so go ahead. Yep. Yes. No. God has given life purely out of his pleasure. He gave it. Now, you as a creature have obligations before God and privileges given to you by God. The very fact that you're alive, the fact that you get to have a rational mind, that you get to make decisions. He allows you the latitude to make choices. He gives you an illusion of free will. That's another topic for another time. He gives you all sorts of things you get to do. And this is a delight. These are all gifts. And see, I don't like this word rights, simply because it creates this kind of rampant individualism and this entitlement thinking. You have the privilege of being able to use them. You have the privilege of being able to use them. You see, you're not going to get me to use the word right. Yeah, for your sake of your neighbor. Natural law is simply the rules that God has built into the universe. And see, that's why it's so ironic that it talks in here about the laws of nature. The laws of nature are established. There's a creator, and he's laid things down. And the laws of nature do not dictate, you guys are free to do whatever you want. That's not a law of nature. A law of nature is you have a responsibility to uphold life. You have a responsibility to care for those who are in your concern. These are the laws of nature. So natural law has more to do with the structure of God's will at work in the world. And then our obligation as creatures is to conform to that will of God. And so that's what we're carrying out. Now, does that give us rights? I say it gives us responsibilities and obligations and duties, and we get these piles of privileges and blessings and gifts given to us along the way that God chooses to do and give to us. But to ever stand up and claim this as my inherent right is not a point of natural law. Natural law puts me under obligation. Natural law gives me responsibilities. Natural law puts an expectation on me, because this is what God put me here to do. I got to get busy doing this. See, and that's why, even the whole idea of the right to life movement, even the terminology, I know the way they do it, and rhetorically it's powerful. I have a right to choose. Well, no, there's a right to this child to have a life. And it's rhetorically very effective. But honestly, I wouldn't say this child has a right to life. This child has been given the gift of life, and we who are to care for this child must protect this child. Must. And to let this child die is scandalous. Okay, and don't get me wrong here, but to hit it from the angle of this child's right is the wrong move to make, I think. It's kind of missing the point. It's arguing from the standpoint of rights instead of arguing from the standpoint of this life is a gift entrusted to us, and we must protect it. It's a completely different way of thinking about the whole thing. We're just framing the question differently, and that's what I want to do. Yeah. Well, my problem is this. I think it starts to get, I see the mischief coming and where it leads. Because I think it starts to lead into sort of an entitlement mentality. I can go to God and say, I have a right to this. You need to give me this. And no, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. And I can't make that claim. Now, can I expect my neighbor to fulfill his obligation to me? Sure. And in the left-hand realm, especially guided by a constitution which we've all agreed on, I can even demand him to do this. Hey, you have a responsibility to me too, follow through on this. But this raises a bunch of interesting questions. And we're getting short up on break time. This raises some really interesting questions. Like, if I really take seriously my Christian responsibility, which is don't stand on your rights, because you don't have any anyway, well then, how do I live in the left hand when it's all about rights and working things out? And Luther, see, I'm not telling you, I'm not making this stuff up. This is Luther. And this is really who's driving me tonight. Usually I tell you who I'm talking about. I didn't tell you. It's Luther who's behind this stuff. Read The Freedom of the Christian Man. And in Freedom of the Christian, he's adamant about this. And in Temporal Authority, to what extent it should be obeyed, he's adamant about this. You have no rights. Before God, you simply live at his mercy, and you delight in that, and so you don't stand on your rights. So if somebody breaks into your house and wants to take everything you've got, what do? Pack it up for him. Go for it, man. Take it. You say, whoa, seriously? And then Luther says, yes, seriously. If somebody smacks you on the right cheek, what do? Give them the left. Right here, buddy, go for it. You say, oh, no, that's wrong. No, you see, that's the Christian ideal. And it's that ruthless application of it which we don't want to hear about. Now, it gets complicated. Because as an individual Christian, it's crystal clear. No rights, give people what they need, I just let it go. Let it go. Just like in, Les Miserables, when the priest gets ripped off and he gets confronted. Oh, he forgot these. Take these too. That's it. See, that's the stunning, that's gospel. That's the Christian living the way he's supposed to. But it gets complicated because we do live in a left-hand world and we have vocation responsibilities. So it's not just me. I've got a wife. I've got kids. I've got to look out for them. So somebody wants to take my stuff. Wait a minute, my kids are depending on this. No, you really can't have it. I don't mind. You could have it if it's just me, but I've got responsibilities. And it gets even more complicated. Well, maybe I let him take my stuff, and then he goes on his merry way, and then he rips off my neighbor. Uh-oh. Now, for my neighbor's sake, I can intervene, but not for my own. That's Luther. Now, it gets really complicated, and it gets really convoluted because, well, I won't stand on my own rights, but I will stand on my neighbor's. And that you can do. But it's never an issue of your rights, my entitlement. That I'm not going to make room for.